Welcome to episode 37 of the Tax Professionals podcast. This episode is all about tax legislation and how to master using it.
Welcome to the Tax Professionals podcast, the podcast dedicated to helping you improve your tax career. Here's your host, Jack Bonehill.
The dreaded Tolley's yellow tax books that cause students nightmares. I've been working in tax for around 3 months and I'd never seen anyone use them before. But I kept seeing them in the filing room, untouched, gathering dust, until one day when a colleague mentioned to me that one of the owners of my employer was adamant and was also trying to instill that we should always be referring to the legislation, whether it be to do some tax research or just to double check a point that we thought we knew. My colleague, however, didn't seem interested. In fact, I think they thought the owner's view was mad. Why would you want to spend your time trawling through the tiniest font, tissue-thin pages and reading the most complicated worded sentences you could ever imagine? My egotistical side has always enjoyed doing things well that others find difficult. At uni, my highest marks were always in the topics that had a reputation for being the most difficult. So in my own weird way, I set myself the goal of learning how to use legislation well. And before I knew it, colleagues kept telling me in my appraisals and things like that my technical skills were my strongest attribute, and I would put that down almost entirely to dedicating time to learning how to use the legislation and then actually using it. It's incredible just how useful a tool it is and how quickly you can build your tax knowledge from it. It's such an invaluable tool, but I do understand why you might be avoiding it. There is perceived complexity, and I say perceived because while it is by no means easy, it also isn't actually as difficult as you may think. So in this episode, I want to share my advice from the experiences that I've had to help you to become comfortable and confident in using legislation. I think you can get away without using legislation as a tax professional, just sticking to guidance and commentary instead. But I personally think that that's a mistake, and I share why I think this is the case in the first section of this episode before moving on to the different types of legislation and why knowing this is important at roughly 6 minutes 40 seconds. The next two sections, sections 3 and 4, which start at roughly 12 minutes 20, is on my advice on how to go from being a legislation rookie to being able to use it well. Section 5, which starts at roughly 21 minutes and 40 seconds, is why you should not assume that words have their usual English meaning, and it also includes my tips on how you can find the specific definitions that are given to words within legislation. Section 6 is about the rules of statutory interpretation, which starts at roughly 25 minutes, and the episode finishes with Section 7, which is my secret tip on how to ramp up your legislation using skills at 29 minutes. There's no need to remember the timings here, as you can get them within the details section of your podcast player or by heading on over to the show notes for this episode at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP37. After this episode, you may also like to listen to How to Undertake Effective Tax Research, which is episode 1 of the podcast, and also How to Build and Maintain Strong Tax Knowledge to Excel as a Tax Professional, episode 6. Links to both of these will be in the show notes, which are at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP37. Make sure you don't miss out on any future episodes of the podcast that will help you to progress, develop, and improve your tax career by subscribing or signing up to email notifications at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/subscribe. The email notifications will give you a brief summary of each episode so that you can decide if you want to listen. Episodes are bi-weekly and are released on Mondays. Without further ado, let's get to it. So why should you use legislation? Well, the legislation is actually the pure form of the rules, the actual law itself as is written and is used by the courts when tax disputes go to a tribunal or other courts. So it's not others' interpretation of the law, which HMRC's guidance is. Other books which give guidance are like the Tolley's books. It is not others' interpretation, it is the actual law. So when you're using legislation, you can actually come up and see your own interpretation and come up with other interpretations, which you can't do from guidance. So lots of legislation is actually down to interpretation. It is so grey and it is not black and white. But the problem is when it comes to guidance, particularly like HMRC's guidance, is they try to make the rules look black and white, which is just not true. And without going to the legislation and using it, then you wouldn't realise that it's grey and not black and white, which I think is a mistake. I actually think that using legislation is the best way to fully understand the tax rules, different possibilities, different options, which I think you don't get fully when you use just guidance. And I think that is because when you're using the legislation, you can actually understand how it all pieces together and how it works. And then when you do that, I think it allows you to answer, I think it allows you to come up with the answer to any tax question. Absolutely any. And I've had an example of this myself where I was doing some expatriate research probably about 3 years ago. And I started off by using HMRC's manuals and Tolly's expatriate tax planning guide or something along those lines. And for the actual situation that I had at the time, after I looked at HMRC guidance and the Tolly's guidance, I wasn't actually 100% sure on what the answer was. And it was only when I went to the legislation and I pieced it all together there that I was confident that I knew the right answer and could get it signed off by colleagues. So I think that is one problem when it comes to guidance. I think it tends to give you the answer to the most obvious or most frequent scenarios, and then sometimes it's really difficult to figure out the correct answer from that guidance. And using legislation, you can actually come and figure out the proper answer yourself. So those are my reasons why I think that you should use legislation and not just rely on guidance and commentary, although of course those things are useful. If you really want to use legislation properly, then I think it's really helpful to understand what I'm going to call the different types of legislation. So in the UK, we have two main types, or maybe even just two types of legislation. Sorry, any lawyers. So primary legislation and secondary legislation. And these are explained in the ATT and CTA law CBE, but from online I've got a little definition to try and help explain exactly what these are and what the differences are. So primary legislation is the term used to describe the main laws passed by the legislative bodies of the UK, e.g. Acts of the UK Parliament, Scottish Parliament, Welsh Parliament and Northern Ireland Assembly. It also includes acts passed by historical parliaments. These types of legislation, primary legislation, are sometimes referred to as statutes. So some examples of primary legislation is ITEPA 2003, which is the most useful one for me working in employment taxes. There's the VAT Act 1994, I believe it is, the Corporation Tax Act 2009, Corporation Tax 2010. So an act is actually a bill, like the finance bill, that has received what's called royal assent, and once a bill receives royal assent, it becomes an act. So hopefully that makes sense. Secondary legislation, also called subordinate legislation, is delegated legislation made by a person or body under authority contained in primary legislation. Typically, powers to make secondary legislation may be conferred on ministers, on the Crown, or on public bodies. The main types of secondary legislation are statutory instruments, statutory rules, orders, and church instruments. So the main one that I use is the Pay As You Earn Regulations 2003. There's also, I believe, VAT regulations, there's national insurance regulations. All of these are statutory instruments. So why is it useful to know the differences? Well, there was this one time when I felt like a bit of an idiot. I'd only just started using legislation and was basically just using ITEPA 2003, which is in one of the particular Tolly's Yellow Handbook. So at least at the time it was in book 1A, and I believe it's still in 1A. But I was looking for a particular rule and I couldn't find it. And I found it online that it was in the Pay As You Earn Regulations 2003 rather than actually in ITEPA. But I couldn't find the Pay As You Earn Regulations 2003 in the Tolly's Yellow Book 1A. So the partner where I was working at the time, when I went to him to basically say, where is this? He went and picked up a different Tolly's Yellow Handbook, book 2A, and flicked straight to it. And at that point I felt a bit of an idiot. And 2A basically contains statutory instruments, whereas book 1A contains primary legislation and acts. So if I would have known that, I would have been able to go and find the right yellow handbook, I would have been able to find the Pay As You Earn Regulations, and I would have been able to find the rule that I was looking at in particular. But because I didn't know about that, I just couldn't find the page on regulations. I just kept looking in book 1A, and obviously that was getting me nowhere. So I would say that's one of the main reasons that it's nice to know the difference and good to know the difference between primary and secondary legislation, because then you can actually find it within College Yellow handbooks and similar ones out there as well. I believe are structured in similar ways, because there are ones out there that aren't Tollys, as I'm sure you know, and also similarly for online guidance and online libraries for using legislation. They tend to structure the legislation and put it into similar categories. So knowing that will help you go to the right place and save you having to feel like an idiot like I did. The other thing that I think is useful to know is, if we go back to the definition, it said that secondary legislation is made under authority contained in primary legislation. So I think a more easy way to describe that is by calling it enabling legislation. So every single piece of secondary legislation has been given the power to be created by an act. So, for example, the Pay-As-You-Earn Regulations 2003 are created under authority given in ITEPA 2003. And so the definitions I've given so far are quite complicated and technical explanations of what primary and secondary legislation are. But kind of my simple way of thinking about it is primary legislation, mainly acts, basically set out the actual rules that are meant to be followed when it comes to taxes. But then the secondary legislation tends to be describing the actual operation of those rules in practice. So, for example, ITEPA 2003 defines pay-as-you-earn income, and then the Pay-As-You-Earn Regulations 2003 say what you do with something that is pay-as-you-earn income. So I fully appreciate that that's an oversimplification of what primary and secondary legislation is, but at least with the legislation that I use, that it tends to fit into that category, and I think that's quite a nice way to think about it, because it might help you to find the right piece of legislation that you need to look at. So now that you understand why you should be using legislation and also the different types of legislation, the next step really to becoming good at using legislation and to become comfortable using it is to just start using legislation. And I think the places where you can start using it are at work, when you're doing pieces of research, and also when you're doing your ATT and CTA qualifications. So when I started using legislation, I started really small. All I wanted to do was look up the travel and expenses rules in ITEPA. So basically sections 337 all the way up to 339. And so that was just a really small area of the legislation, and I almost felt like that was actually quite a good introduction, because I knew a bit about those rules anyway at the time, and then I could see it in context in the legislation, so that was really useful for me. ITEPA, I've said a few times, is like the main piece of legislation for me that I use, particularly in terms of acts. So this comes on to my next point, which is get to know the key piece of legislation that are relevant to your job. So you could just ask your colleagues to figure out what these are, or you could do something similar to what I did, which is basically just keep building it up over time. So ITEPA was the one that I first started using because that was the one that cropped up first, and then kind of moved on to the Pay-As-You-Earn regulations, and then on to different acts that contain the rules for national insurance and the regulations that are related to that. So I just kept on adding and kept building over time, as and when I kind of had the need to do research on a particular area. So HMRC guidance and other guidance out there are actually really good for helping you to figure out kind of the different pieces of legislation out there that are useful for you, because they tend to reference it. So for me, that's where I started getting the awareness and the knowledge of, I suppose, the relevant acts for me, and then I could start using them. Once you've started using a piece of legislation for a while, then one thing I think that's really useful to do is to understand the structure of the piece of legislation, so the acts or the regulations that you're looking at. So I think a good place to start is the contents page for that particular piece of legislation, because that will give you a really good idea of what is covered by that piece of legislation and also how to find it. I would say a very typical structure for legislation is to have it broken down into parts, so like part 1, part 2, part 3, etc. And then within each part to have chapters, so part 1, chapter 2, part 1, chapter 3, and so on. And then within each chapter, so when you're looking in an act at least, it will have sections within each chapter. And if you're in regulations, people tend to call it either a regulation or a paragraph within the chapter. So by looking at the contents page, you can figure out how it's structured, how it's broken down, and that'll help you to know what's included, and then also how to find the information, the right part of the legislation that you want to look at. And just one last comment on this is always make sure that you use up-to-date legislation. So the legislation that's available on the government website, particularly for tax, just doesn't seem to be updated. And as you all well know, if you worked in tax for more than a few months, tax rules get regularly updated. So legislation can come out of date very quickly. So always make sure that you're using an up-to-date piece of legislation, whether that's the most recent Tolley's books, whether it's online guidance, whatever it is, just make sure you're using some legislation that is fully up to date. So the point of my last tip really is to help you to become comfortable and to just get used to using legislation, even if you're not using it in much detail and you're just using it a little bit here and there to kind of get used to it. But I think once you've gotten over that stage, I think the next thing to do really is to just start using it regularly, start going in depth on areas of either interest to you or are most relevant to your job. You know, it could even be a necessity if you're doing pieces of research. So what I did personally was every single piece of research that I did, whatever the tax question is, I tried to find the relevant sections, the relevant paragraphs within the legislation. And don't get me wrong, it was an extremely painful process to go through to begin with because I didn't really know where to start. But over time, the more I used it, the more in-depth research that I did, the more easy it became, even reading the ridiculously complex sentences, finding a needle in a haystack, which essentially you feel like you're doing sometimes within legislation. It became easier with the more practice that I'd had. So in terms of going in depth, I just want to give you a little bit of an example from some research that I did. I've already mentioned it. It was when I did some expatriate research where I couldn't find the answer in HMRC guidance or some external guidance I had as well. So legislation is sometimes like trying to piece a jigsaw puzzle together or just solving a problem, and you've got to piece together a little piece of information to come to the answer. So when I was doing this expat research, I needed to figure out whether certain income was pay-as-you-earn income to know whether or not it needed to be taxed through the payroll. And so I started off by finding the definition of pay-as-you-earn income. So within the same section that pay-as-you-earn income is defined, it also defines what's called a pay-as-you-earn employment income. And it says that consists of taxable earnings and taxable specific income. So then if you follow through the definition of taxable earnings, which is defined at a different section completely, it says that taxable earnings is amounts as determined by chapters 4 and 5 of part 2 ITEPA. So then you can go to chapter 4 and 5 to find out what income is taxable earnings. And when you go to chapters 4 and 5, you can see that chapter 4 is split down into taxable earnings of those who are UK residents, and chapter 5 is essentially everyone else or any people who are under the remittance basis and are non-UK residents. So kind of the point of telling you this is you've got to keep piecing the jigsaw puzzle together, because in order to fully figure out what pay-as-you-earn income is, you have to figure out whether or not a piece of income falls within chapter 4 or 5 of part 2. And this is just part of the jigsaw. So there's then also other questions that were kind of going around my mind at the time that would need to be fully understood to kind of understand whether or not a piece of money received by an individual needed to be taxed through the payroll or not. And you know, that could include understanding what year the earnings are earned in, when they are treated as received, which is when you need to apply pay-as-you-earn. And so then this kind of process of piecing it together kind of starts all over again. Once you have pieced the puzzle together though fully, you've just got a wealth of information, and you can answer a slightly different question where, say, one fact's changed to another one, and you can still find the answer to it. Whereas I think the problem sometimes when it comes to using guidance is that you may know the answer to one question, but what if that one little fact changes? Would you still know what the answer is then or not? And I feel like using legislation really helps you to get over that. Hopefully something you've taken away from that example as well is that you shouldn't really just look at one single section and then feel like you fully understand what you're looking at, because without looking at the wider context, I don't think you can fully appreciate and fully understand a single section that you're looking at. I think an example of this for me at least was when I first started working in employment taxes, I didn't understand what the difference between exemptions and deductions were. And when I asked the colleague, they just didn't really know the answer either and said that they are similar and they essentially do the same thing. But that didn't really cut it for me at the time. I wanted to actually understand why. And if you kind of dig further into ITEPA, and you can see how it pieces all together with all these different definitions, kind of like what I've just talked about with the pay-as-you-earn income example, then you can see the difference between exemptions and deductions. And I know I keep giving employment tax examples here. That's because they're the ones that are the most regular for me to use. But these things equally apply to other pieces of legislation as well. So I've done similar pieces of research with VAT and corporation tax as well. So I don't want you to think that these examples just solely apply to employment taxes. So I'll just end this section by saying that for me, how I got used to using legislation and became much more comfortable using it was to just keep using it. And I know that sounds obvious, but I think it's really easy to shy away from picking up the book or going onto your online software to find the legislation and use it. But I feel like if you don't do that, then you're just not going to give yourself the opportunity to become used to it and be able to use it well. I suppose I have been fortunate as well in some ways, because very early on in my career I had opportunities to do some very in-depth pieces of research around some very particular things, and that definitely helped me to develop the skill. But I think as long as you're using legislation regularly, almost at every opportunity that you can, then you will be able to build a strong skill for using it. So one of the areas where I think it's really easy to make a mistake when using legislation is to not appreciate that many words within legislation are given particular specific definitions. They don't just take their ordinary English definition. So when you use legislation, just don't ever presume that they have their normal English usage definition. Always check. And I remember when I first started using legislation, it was like one of the most painful parts was finding where definitions were. And I wish I'd have known this when I first started using it. So when you're looking in acts, there's usually an interpretation section in the last part of an act. And within that section, they usually have definitions and other things to help interpret certain sections or certain parts of an act. So, for example, in ITEPA 2003, the last part, part 13, has definitions and interpretations within that section. The Corporation Tax Act 2010, part 25, which is the last part of that act, has definitions for the purposes of that act. So acts tend to have definitions in other places as well, dependent on the act and dependent on the definition you're looking for. So it could be contained within a particular chapter, or it could be within a particular part, and usually when that happens, a specific definition is given for that chapter or for that part. So, for example, in ITEPA 2003, the off-payroll working rules, the new IR35 rules, is in Chapter 10, Part 2, and within that Chapter 10, it's at the end, or at least very close to the end, there is a section that has definitions that are used within that chapter. If you're lucky, a definition could be within the actual section that you're looking at anyway, which is nice and easy, but I would say rare. And there's been so many times where a definition has been staring me in the face in the section I'm looking at, and I'm thinking it must be in a more difficult place to find. So don't brush over that. Give it the time and attention it deserves. Properly look at the section to see whether the definition is within that section that you're looking at. And kind of one last example is the pay-as-you-earn regulations has a list of definitions right at the start. I believe it's paragraph 1 or regulation 1 of those regulations has a list of the definitions, and it points you to all the particular paragraphs or where each word is defined. So a lot of different places, but they tend to usually be, I would say, right at the start or right at the end, whether that's in relation to the full act or the full regulations, or within a particular part or chapter itself, usually at the start or end. So I just want to very quickly touch upon how to interpret legislation, because I think that's also important. I mean, it's no secret that legislation is worded in a complicated and non-easy way to read. So there are times when something is unclear or ambiguous, amongst loads of other things. But there are actually rules for interpreting legislation which are used by the courts when they're interpreting certain tax rules or any piece of legislation, I believe, for that matter. So I believe that all the rules are as follows: the literal rule, the golden rule, the mischief rule, and the purposive rule. So the literal rule basically says that each word takes their plain, literal, and ordinary meaning. The golden rule tends to be used where the literal rule would result in something absurd or obnoxious, and so the golden rule will look for another meaning of the words to avoid that absurd or obnoxious result. The mischief rule is used when remedying what they call a defect in the legislation. So when something's missed or it doesn't seem to cover something, and when that happens, the court can interpret something in a manner that will give a remedy and suppress what they define as the mischief. The purposive rule, which I think is more often used in European legislation, is that it says to interpret the legislation in the context of the law's purpose. So when they're doing that, they tend to look at like the materials that were created at the time when they were drafting the legislation and what they were trying to achieve by doing it, and then interpret the legislation in line with that. So the literal rule, the golden rule, the mischief rule, and the purposive rule. So unless you're practicing law, you can probably get away without really knowing those in any level of detail, but I think it's comforting in that there's been so many times when I've been reading a section over and over again, and I'm like, this makes zero sense. It's nice to know that actually there is some legislation out there that just doesn't make sense, really, when you're reading it strictly in using the literal rule, which is, I suppose, what my default is. The thing is, though, I suppose you're never going to know exactly which one of these rules a court is going to apply to a particular piece of legislation, but knowing about it, I think, is useful. There's also something called the Interpretation Act 1978, which is out there to help with interpreting legislation. Don't propose to go into this in any detail, but it's nice to know about. And the last thing I think is useful to know about when interpreting legislation is case law. So case law is when a particular dispute, if you want to call it that, goes to court and is looked at by a court. And when they do that, they come to a conclusion in relation to particular tax disputes, and that usually involves legislation. And once a piece of legislation, a particular part of it, has been concluded on by a court, then that can be binding or persuasive in relation to the rules that the court was interpreting. So when there is binding case law, it means that every other court must follow that same ruling in relation to the same dispute, essentially. I mean, I'm oversimplifying a bit here, but that's the gist of it. But persuasive is something that should be taken into account by other courts, but they don't need to follow the ruling. So this is generally speaking, but courts of the same level are usually persuasive on each other. So a first-tier tribunal ruling will be persuasive in another first-tier tribunal ruling, but it won't be binding. But then when you move up the court structure, so when you get to the upper tribunal, so the upper tribunal's ruling will bind the first tier in the future in relation to rulings on basically the same type of dispute. But upper tribunals, I believe, are persuasive on upper tribunals and not binding. So just to recap, courts of the same level are persuasive on each other, and ones that are higher will be binding on the ones beneath it. So for tax, I believe I'm right in saying this, it might be an overgeneralisation, but no case will be binding until it has at least gone to the upper tribunal. If you're really keen, I just want to very briefly mention how using case law can be useful when becoming better and improving your skills at using legislation. So when cases go to the courts, there's usually full transcripts of the written outcome of the case. I think these are great for a few reasons. They tend to list all the relevant parts of legislation that are used in relation to, that are relevant in relation to the dispute and what are actually used. You will then see how the courts follow through the definitions and piece the legislation together, essentially. You will see how usually three people interpret the legislation, because you usually get HMRC, you get their view, you get the taxpayer's view or whoever's defending them. So that's two views, and then you also get the view of the court itself. So that's at least three different interpretations, which I think all that's invaluable. So if you're really serious about being able to use legislation well, then I can highly recommend having a look at case law relevant to the area of tax that you work in. Summary then for this episode. Legislation is the actual law as enacted and not others' interpretation of it. And I personally think that it's the best way to fully understand tax rules and that you should use tax legislation often. There are primary and secondary legislation. Know the difference between them because if you don't, you may struggle to find what you're looking for. To start getting comfortable with legislation, just start using it. I know it sounds obvious, but you can start using it as part of your work or even as part of your ATT and CTA. And once you become comfortable with it and you start to become better at using it, then I just think you should start using it more regularly, as much as you can, with every piece of research if possible. And when you are doing research, go in depth and try and go in depth on the areas of interest, relevance or necessity to the area of tax that you work in. Do not assume that words have their usual meaning. Check for definitions, which are usually at the start or end of either the whole piece of legislation within a chapter or even a part. They're usually at the start or end. And there are rules for interpreting legislation: the literal rule, the golden rule, the mischief rule and the purposive rule. There's the Interpretation Act, and also case law sets precedents which are binding or persuasive. Using case law is a great way to see how legislation is used in practice by a court, and I think it's got so much valuable information in there, so give it a go. And I actually challenge you to read and analyse one tax case that's relevant to the area of tax that you work in. If you like this episode, then you may also like to listen to How to Undertake Effective Tax Research, which is episode 1 of the podcast, and also How to Build and Maintain Strong Tax Knowledge, which is episode 6 of the podcast. And links to both of these will be in the show notes at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP37, and that just stands for the Tax Professionals Podcast episode 37. I'll also put some links in to have some further reading around the types of legislation and statutory interpretation in case you're interested, so you will find those as well in the show notes. But if you enjoy this episode, then please subscribe or sign up for email notifications to make sure that you don't miss out on any future episodes. And you can sign up or subscribe at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/subscribe. The emails will give you a brief summary of each episode, which are released bi-weekly on Mondays. But that's it for this episode. I hope you liked the episode and have taken away some useful points to help you to progress, develop and improve your tax career. Until next time.